All right, good morning. Good to see each and every one of you. For those of you that are visiting with us, we're so glad you're here as well. And for those that are visiting with us via live stream, we appreciate your presence also. We're studying this morning from the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 15. So we've got quite a task to be able to go through all of these chapters. But we will, as we continue this survey, then we'll, I believe, be benefited by what God's Word has to tell us and the things that we can learn. Like Paul said, the things written aforetime were written for our learning in Romans 15:4. And certainly there is much for us to remember and grasp and hold fast to the blessed Word of God. Before we get started, I'll say real quickly, please be prepared Wednesday evening. That'll be August the 18th, and consider chapter 16, 17, and 18. Brother Paul Cook will be leading us in that study. And Lord willing that we meet together again, we'll certainly look forward to that. So as we get into chapters 12, what I'd like to try to do this morning is to look at each chapter, give an overview, and then make some application to some New Testament passages for us as well, that we can encourage one another, that we can truly be benefited, that will be pleasing unto God. With that, last week, I think it's good for us to revisit this. We know that in the book of Deuteronomy, we find the Shema, or that is the idea of the Jews saying to hear and obey. Hear and obey. And particularly this prayer that's recited daily, and was recited daily and still is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And as we begin to think about the focal point of those words in the life of individuals that are serving God, certainly that extends to us today as we think about our life and how that should be radiating from us, and how that we should hold close to that. Brother Paul brought up last week as well, in this text you see the seriousness of it and the great responsibility of parents to teach their children. And we discussed the idea of what greater gift could we give our children than the solid foundation of the gospel of Christ, knowing who God is, knowing what He represents, and knowing how He will walk with them through their lives, and give them the stability and the seriousness of the life, and really the understanding of life and what it represents and what it means. These words that I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So you see as the daily walk that one should have in sharing the Word of God with their family. And certainly as we turn to the New Testament, I thought of something that fathers are to bring up their children, aren't they? In the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And as we think about that, as we think about the involvement of mothers and the instruction that they give, think about Timothy, who was very responsible for who Timothy was at his core. That's right, his mother and his grandmother. How about that? Isn't that a wonderful illustration? So parents, grandparents, let us all understand the great impact that we can have on our families and the responsibility that we have concerning our families. Just a little touch of geography before we move on, just to give us some idea about what's going on here, where we are with Moses and what's going to take place in this book. We've been pointing out and looking at these areas here, and really when you see these fancy terms, I'm not an archaeologist, but when you see these terms like tell, and here's a tell, and here's a tell, that simply just means a mound. So archaeologists have found these mounds, these areas, and you'll notice here, again, I'll point out these question marks. So the idea that perhaps this is where Shittim was, and then we come down to Beth Jeremoth, and we look at Numbers 33:49 that points out for us that this is the area where the children of Israel were between these two spots in the plains of Moab. So just to give you an idea, and we'll look at some distances here in just a second to help us think about that. So here's Jericho over here, and of course the Jordan River, and here we have the Dead Sea, and of course if you go up, the Sea of Galilee is going to be up here. So as we look at this aerial photo, this is very interesting, I think. Here is Mount Nebo, all right, and what do we know about Mount Nebo? What is something that comes to mind related to Moses? Yeah. That's it. Moses goes to look at the promised land from Mount Nebo. So you begin to see, here's Mount Nebo, here's the Dead Sea, here's the Jordan River. Here again are those areas that possibly we think about Shittim, possible locations of Shittim. And what I wanted us to see is you could go today to Mount Nebo and see this particular section that's right here. It's very interesting because where you would be standing from here, you begin to look and say, okay, Jericho would be off in this distance as they have this line, and it even gives you the distances. It's 27 kilometers. So I was raised on mileage and not on kilometers. I had to, as my old friend said, I had to goggle that up and take a look at it and see what was going on there. But you're roughly about 17 miles from Mount Nebo to Jericho. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it, as you look at those distances. Here is Jerusalem, about 40 kilometers, as you begin to see Jerusalem being set here, so it'll be off in this distance. And then here we go over to Hebron. And think about Hebron. You remember who is buried at Hebron in that area in the cave of Machpelah? Sarah. Abraham also buried there in that area, the land of the Hittites, as they were sojourning through that land. So as you begin to look at all of this, and it's really not a huge area as you think about all of these places. Here's Bethlehem as well, and Bethlehem would be off towards this distance here. And then you go over, and one place that I want us to look at just for a second and think about, here's Qumran. All right, about 25 miles as we think about the distance there. And remember, have you ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found? And that's the area that you would find there. And then, of course, on this one, I'll stop with one last point here as we think about the Lake Tiberias. Okay, Lake Tiberias this way. And as you think about it being about 106 kilometers, I think roughly some 65 miles, what's another translation for Lake Tiberias in the New Testament? You'll know this. The Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee. So from the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River runs down and eventually empties into the Dead Sea as we begin looking at this, okay? So I thought that might be interesting to you, but Jericho not very far across the plain, and here's another look from Mount Nebo to the Dead Sea area as you begin to see those things on a beautiful, clear day there as well. So let's get into our lesson and talk about what we find in the book of Deuteronomy. I want to share with you just a couple of some overview points as we think about this and look at just kind of standing back and getting a high view of this book and thinking about it before we dive into the text. Think about it being the final book of the Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the 5th book of the Pentateuch as we consider that. It contains Moses' last 3 sermons and 2 prophetic poems about Israel's future. He talks about their past mistakes. And what good would that do to talk about their past mistakes? Why should they be reminded of such? Don't make them again. That's exactly right. Don't do them again. And realize the consequences. Remember, an 11-day journey took 40 years. An 11-day journey took 40 years. So there are consequences to sin, and that's a great lesson for us today as well. So in this book, Moses urges Israel to trust and obey and to conquer the land. Trust and obey and conquer the land. That's a great lesson for us, isn't it, as we think about trusting, obeying, and are we marching towards a promised land? Most certainly we are. And we need to have our trust and obedience in check as well. He highlights God's uniqueness. That's very interesting too, I think, because who do we serve? You think about if you had to tell someone the characteristics of God and sit down and discuss it with someone, how would you describe the great God of heaven? And you go back to the Old Testament, you begin to think about all the wonderful things that we can see there, His power, His might. And then when we get to the life of Jesus, you think about all the things that Jesus displayed. Can you imagine being sitting in the boat with the disciples and they're afraid they're going to perish, and they actually say, Master, aren't you concerned that we'll perish? And He gets up and He says to the wind and the waves, He says, peace, be still. And what happened? It was as He said. To be in His presence, to understand that He controlled and to the demons. You see, we find and can go to the book of James, even the demons understand who Jesus is. And He had control over all of those things that we find that would plague mankind. And that's who we serve. It talks about His power over the nations and the armies. Certainly God rules in the kingdoms of men, and His will not be thwarted. His grace and His faithfulness to His people. Do you think in the book of Deuteronomy so far that we've looked at this and we've looked back at the history of Israel, has God been gracious with this people? Have they been rebellious? Have they been stiff-necked? Have they been individuals who time and time again just wanted to go their own way and do their own thing? And His grace and His faithfulness has been true to them. However, we see that there are consequences to sin, and He has truly wrought judgment upon them as well. He reminds the people that God promised the land, that God's gift of the land is undeserved, and that the land is full of good things. Interesting parallel, isn't it, as you go through that and as you think about our journey as well, and as you consider what's taking place in our lives. So let's look at, real quickly, I just wanted to hit these key themes. I know there's a lot up there, but and this is a bit redundant, but perhaps it will help us to remember the idea of God's uniqueness, His election, or Israel's election, the land's goodness. He's faithful to His promise keeping, His power to defeat the enemies of the land, His exhortations to Israel to love, serve, fear, and obey God, and the warnings in this book against idolatry and instruction for proper worship, the impact of His laws, and Moses' imminent death. Just real quickly, have you ever been to the burial site of Moses? And I don't mean to be flippant. That's a trick question. Where is he buried? Only God knows. God buried him. God buried him. Only God knows. What about that for a funeral service? To have God bury you. All right. In this outline where we are today in chapter 12, we're going to be in the midst of the second speech that Moses is giving. So that gets us into Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we'll look at an outline here for just a second. We'll not look at every passage. If there's something if you'd like to interject something, just please let me know, and be more than happy for you to do that. As we think about this chapter, here are the four things basically that you find in this chapter. We see the idea of the instructions of destroying the Canaanite religion. Now, some people might look at this and say, well, this just looks really, or it's difficult for me to understand how God would suggest that the Canaanites just be utterly destroyed. I want to suggest something to you. Time won't allow us to dig into this and look at it, but it is a true biblical principle that the Canaanites had become such a ruthless and lawless and sinful people that God was bringing judgment upon them. And that's what was taking. You look back at their history and you see it in their worship, in the sacrifice of children, in all of the things that we can find as we are going to look back at some things that the Israelites got engaged in too. But we find that they are to destroy this religion. They're to bring sacrifices and gifts, and please note this, to the chosen place and rejoice. We're going to see God begin to formulate and help them understand as they go from a people who have been mobile. They have been encamped around the tabernacle. Now they're going into the land. They're going to inherit this land, and some things are going to change as far as God's going to choose in the sense of where they are going to come and worship. We're going to see the consumption of non-sacrificial meats and sacrificial regulations. There's some discussion around that. We'll not spend a lot of time there, but again, now that they're coming into the land, this discussion is going to be placed to them. And then look at this, avoid the Canaanite religion. This chapter really opens and closes in talking about the Canaanite religion. Why do you think that might be important? And let me just, before you answer that, let me suggest that what had happened at Baal Peor? Remember that? Where they were enticed to engage in fornication, in worship to false gods. And so we think about the Canaanites, and we begin reading. Look at verse 1, if you will, of Deuteronomy chapter 12. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods. Note that plural. They were polytheistic. There were many gods. There were all kinds of things going on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. So in reality, what was to take place with this false worship as they entered the land? Total elimination. That's a good way to put it, Carrie. Excuse me. So as you think about that, we're going to see later on in our study this morning the reason why and the great difficulties that would be encountered by such. Look at what he says in verse 3. You shall tear down their altar, smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherim and with fire. You shall cut down the engraved images of their gods, and you shall obliterate their name from the place. You shall not act like this towards the Lord your God. But you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God shall choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. So very interesting as we begin to look at what's taking place here. And I want to just jump over to some applications about this text and really kind of drill down on this a little bit as we think of it. As you look at worship and serving God as he chooses, I want to suggest to you that the New Testament does not have a buffet or present a buffet style religion. And I think you understand the principle I'm trying to suggest there. When we go through a buffet, we pick out what we want, don't we? And we put it on our plate, depending upon what our palate desires. But the New Testament is not like that. God tells us specific, many instances, and I think gives us a specific pattern for what is pleasing to him. And let me just ask this. How do we know what is pleasing to God? His Word. His Word. Only what he reveals to us, right? That's how we know. And we begin to look at such things, and just some passages I wanted to go through and think about for just a second with you. These are passages that you'll be very familiar with, but the idea in Matthew 16 and 18. This was always a very interesting passage to me as I was studying the gospel before I became a Christian. And as Peter makes this confession of who Christ is, Jesus said, "I will build my church." Is that singular or plural? Singular, isn't it? Yeah, it's singular. It goes in reference with this kingdom that's going to come. And we see that he says, "I'm going to build this kingdom." And the disciples had a hard time understanding that. They thought it was going to be a literal kingdom where the glory days of David would be reestablished. And we begin to understand that because if I remember correctly from this history, David expanded the children of Israel's land holdings tenfold under his kingship. And that allowed Solomon to rule over this huge kingdom and this very wealthy kingdom at the time. So they thought that was coming back. That's what they assumed is coming back. And what's interesting, Laura and I, my wife and I, had a study with a young man in Haines City, Florida, in our house, who suggested the same thing. He was still waiting for the Messiah. And so that is still something that's held today. So as you look at this, go over to Matthew 28 for just a moment. You'll know this text. I wanted to share this with you for just a second. Because what's interesting from this beautiful text as we think about what Jesus has to say, it really reveals to us who has all authority. Jesus came up and spoke to them saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth." Now, what does that mean? If someone has all authority, what does that reflect and mean? What he says rules, right? What he says what he directs. And he goes on to say, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." Look at this. This is interesting. "Teaching them to observe all that I commanded you." He even gives us the content, doesn't it, that we are to follow. Jesus has authority, and we're to follow all those things that he has commanded. And I love the last part of verse 20. "Lo, I am with you always." Goes right along with what Hebrews 13:5 says, doesn't it? "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Lo, I am with you always. Another interesting passage, and I know there are many, you're probably thinking of many that I've overlooked or we just don't have time to look at, but I wanted to suggest to you as we think about this theme of worshiping as God chooses, the Apostle Paul identifies something for us in 1 Corinthians 4 and 17. I've always found this text very interesting as well, because what it tells us, and let me just share it with you, then we'll discuss it just real briefly. "For this reason I've sent to you Timothy, who is my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, and he will remind you of my ways which are in Christ." So where did Paul get his ways? From Christ. But look at this very last phrase in this text. "Just as I teach everywhere in every church." The point being, I think, a fair question to ask, did Paul teach something different at churches? Did he go to Ephesus and teach something different? Did he go to Philippi and change things around there? Did he go to Colossae and change things? No, he taught the same thing as he wrote, and as he would see various congregations, he taught the same thing in every church. So what that points us towards is something that I want to look at over in the book of Ephesians for just a minute. Ephesians chapter 4. Because, again, the Apostle Paul writing to those at Ephesus, those who eventually are warned in the book of Revelation that they have left their first love and they will repent and come back, he writes to them and says, Let's just back up, if you will, to verse 1. I want to read this whole thing. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, entreat you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness and with patience, showing forbearance to one another in love. That's a great lesson in itself, how we treat one another, isn't it? Be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Now look at where he goes now in verse 4. There is one body. Does that coincide with what Jesus said in Matthew 16 and 18? Sure does. I will build my church. Paul said there's one body, there's one Spirit, and we begin to understand that. How many Holy Spirits are there? There's one. Just as you were called in one hope of your calling, now look at verse 5. How many Messiahs were there? There's one. There's one Lord. There's one faith. So here we have it. There is one faith, this doctrine that Jesus, his commandments, this set of teachings that he has set forth. There's one faith. There is one baptism, of which every converted example in the book of Acts obeyed. One God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. And so as we think about that, I'll just end this application with the little book of Jude. And I want you to think about a text that you've heard a lot, but I think is just worth underscoring and highlighting, however you want to do it. But he says in verse 3 of the book of Jude, Beloved, while I was making every effort to write you about our common salvation, I felt it necessary to write to you appealing, now look at what he appeals to them to do, appealing for you to contend earnestly. That's basically saying that you need to fight for. I'm not talking about physical fisticuffs, but you need to contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all delivered to the saints. It's not an ongoing revelation. It's not something that is continued. It was once and for all delivered to the saints, he said. We have it. We study it. We understand it. Remember, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God, Romans 10:17. So we see this being said that we need to contend earnestly for the faith. God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. We have those tools if we would but lay hold of them. And look at how I believe that parallels with what we find in the book of, or chapter 12, verse 32. Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take away from it. What if someone says, and I don't mean to be disrespectful here, but this is something that I faced as a young man. What if someone says that all you need to do to become right with God is to just believe? Baptism is not essential. I would suggest to you that's adding to and taking away from the Word of God. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, right? Men and brethren, what shall we do? Acts chapter 2. That's the question that was asked. Repent and be baptized, every one of you, for the remission of your sins. Right? So that's the things we face. I have had individuals in my home that suggest to me that a man by the name of Joseph Smith, at around the age of 15, had this vision. He also suggested to me that the apostles that he, quote unquote, served could raise people from the dead. I think that is not found in God's Word. And that's the challenge we face from day to day, that we humbly open up God's Word, that we strive to know what He has said, that we try to do the things that He has asked us to do and not add to and not take away. Any comments on chapter 12? Okay, let's jump into chapter 13. Chapter 13 is divided into basically these sections, or I use these headings to worship the true and living God. Let me just stop there. Is that something you think is important today? Do we look around the world today and see individuals suggesting that there are other ways that, or other things or people that can be worshiped besides the God of heaven? Yeah, you can. You see that. Resist false prophets. This is a very interesting text. Resist false teaching family members. That's very interesting, and I think a warning for us as we begin to look at this. Resist movements that teach false doctrine. We say all of that, and if you would turn back with me to this text as Moses is warning them about such things, and great application, I think, for us as well. Look at chapter 13. I'll start reading in verse 1. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true concerning which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, you shall not listen to the words of the prophet or the dreamer of dreams. Note the enticement here, to go after other gods. Then you drop down to verse 6. Look at this. If your brother, your mother's son. Now, I'm sure most of you probably have siblings in this audience, and you know hopefully how close you are to them. I'll tell you, the gospel will divide families. Jesus said it would. It will. And it's not God doing the dividing. It's individuals doing the dividing because they make different decisions. It's just like the 12 spies were divided that we've studied. 10 said, no, we can't do it, but 2 said, yes, we can. Did God tell them all the same message, give them all the same opportunity, give them evidence of the same thing? Yes, He did. But choices were made, unfortunately. So if your brother, your mother's son, your son or daughter, your wife, look at that. Your son or daughter, your wife you cherish, or your friend who is at as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods whom neither you nor your fathers have known. You follow on down in that text, and what you find is, they shall be stoned. So let's just stop and ask, why the severity of punishment and why the seriousness of such warnings? Anybody want to?
It's like a cancer.
I'm sorry?
It's like a cancer. It doesn't just stay in one place. It just continues to grow, and they don't shut it out.
Yep.
It will overtake you.
Yep. And so the response is it's like a cancer that will continue to grow and will destroy. And you think about this, if someone is enticing you, in this text we're seeing to serve other gods, or to walk away from what God has commanded, and you follow that, you think about what detriment is that going to have for your eternal destiny? And hopefully, someone can be taught out of that, but we see the seriousness of how that responses can be given to affect individuals and cause problems. And certainly as we think about this, resisting false prophets, resisting false teaching family members, and even if a village, if we find that somewhere in a village was saying the same thing, that village was to be burned in the latter part of this text. So what I simply want us to look at in this application is the idea of being aware of evil influences. And so you think about that, and let's look at a couple of passages that I think will help warn us too, that we too can, if we're not careful, can be persuaded by those that may be close to us, those that we have respect for, those that we might deem to be very wise in some instances, but if they are speaking things that are not of God, then that is dangerous, very dangerous. If you look at Jude 3 and 4, we talked about this contending earnestly for the faith. But look at verse 4. Certain persons, Jude said, have crept in unnoticed, those who were long beforehand marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of our Lord into licentiousness and deny our only Lord and Master. Okay. And so we see this deviation from God's Word. There are just so many passages, and I'm running out of time here, unfortunately, but I want to take you to the book of Luke, and let's look at Luke 14 so we can go through and look at some of these others here real quick. Luke 14, and then we'll move on. But the words of the Lord are just very, very sobering here in this particular text. Luke 14, starting in verse 26. Jesus had turned to the multitudes and he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. I want to suggest to you that what's being said here is the fact that we are to put God first, aren't we? Above all. Above our family members, above all those, above our own life. And he says in verse 27, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. God comes first is the great lesson. Chapter 14, Israel's special status. Verses 1 and 2, we see that God had really chosen them as to be a special people. The discussion of clean and unclean foods. And then we talk about the tithe that they were to bring in chapter 14, verses 22 through 29. So with that being said, let's just jump over and let's make some applications to that real quick. I want you to think about this. The Lord has chosen you. For those who have obeyed the gospel of Christ and are striving to do God's will, the Lord has chosen you. Now I'll tell you what, I don't know if you remember, if you've ever been chosen for something in the past. Maybe it was you were chosen for a sports team. Maybe you were chosen at school for some special award. Maybe you were chosen for whatever, and it just made you feel so wonderful about it. I'll tell you, the most wonderful thing is you're chosen by God. You are a treasured possession. And to prove that, real quickly, let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 9. Peter says it this way, speaking to those folks that he was encouraging, you're a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people. Now listen to this. You now are the people of God. Anybody ever trace back their lineage? Quite frankly, I'm scared to do mine. We're Irish, and I'm sure my ancestors got off the prison boat in New York, more than likely. So anyway, the point being, I've heard folks say, well, I can trace my lineage back to George Washington. I can trace my lineage back to so-and-so or this or that. That doesn't amount to anything versus your pedigree as a Christian. You are a child of God. He said, you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Now you've received mercy. How beautiful that is. There are other texts we could look at that I have listed there, but I just want to point out the idea of giving in the Old Testament. We can go all the way back to Abraham. We can look at what he gave to Melchizedek before the law of Moses. We're going through the law of Moses now, and we run to the New Testament. And a passage that's always stuck out in my mind is Malachi 3, looking through that text where they're asked the question, will a man rob God? And they were in such destitute state, they were bringing crippled and blind and lame animals. They were just bringing the refuse, so to speak, the discards to be given to him. And I hope that we will never do that. It's not about how much we're giving in the sense, as long as we're looking at the proportions of what God has blessed us with, is what I really want to say. The idea of giving our best, the idea of ourselves and our monetary gifts that God has so graciously blessed us with. And we can look at 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. We can think about 2 Corinthians 9 and 6, that we'll reap what we sow. And then in Philippians 4 and 15, where we think about the idea of what was given to the Apostle Paul by the brethren at Philippi. And he goes on to tell them in that text, God shall supply all your needs in Christ Jesus. So as we look at these beautiful texts, just a reminder for us that we examine ourselves, that we make sure we're not giving God the leftovers, and that we're putting Him first. Chapter 15 talks about the canceling of debts. We start getting into the sabbatical year. Remember, there were things that were to be done every seventh year, then with the years of Jubilee and so forth. The freeing of slaves in verses 12 through 18, and regulations for the sacrificial offerings that are found of the firstborn animals. All this he begins to set forth as they're entering this land and becoming so very close to having this land of their own and this property of their own. The thing that I want us to see about this, that I think we learn from all of this, is the treatment of brethren. The Israelites were told that they were to take care of their own. They were to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the needy that was amongst them, and to deal with that and to do that in the way that God would have them to do it. And I want to suggest to you that the New Testament is full of passages that help us understand how we are to treat one another. And if you go over to the book of Philippians, I'd like to go there for just a second, in chapter 2, and note what Paul said in this beautiful text. He said, I'll start in verse 3, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." Boy, how about that? Is that a challenge? I think about John 13. Can you imagine being there at the Last Supper, and the King of Kings, the Messiah, gets up from supper, girds himself with a towel, and starts to wash the disciples' feet. Individuals who had arguments among themselves about who was the greatest. And he washes their feet to teach them a great lesson. A lesson of humility, a lesson of service. And they were to understand his outpouring to them, and they were to reflect that to others. I'll tell you, this is a great challenge, I think, and I'll get in the front of the line here, to stop and to think about others and regarding them more important than myself. Verse 4, he continues, "Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped." That's humbling, isn't it, when you think about that and think about how we are to treat and engage and love one another. We can look at so many texts that we are to do good to all men in Galatians 6:10, but especially unto the household of faith. We can think about James chapter 3. I'll direct you there for just a second. I know our time is coming to a close very quickly, but I want to look at what James says in this chapter, the idea of doing the will of God, that it's not just faith, it's an active faith, not just a discussion of saying I believe, but an active faith. And he says in about verse 14, consider this, what use is it, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, imagine this, someone shows up at your house, or you know of a brother and sister, you're in their presence, they need something, and you say, go in peace, shalom, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body. What use is that? Even so, faith, if it hath no works, is dead, being by itself. May we be a faithful people, an active people, showing our humility and our service as our Lord did, as He washed the disciples' feet. Thank you for your good attention.